Purdue season just ended, but with one of the most intriguing rosters we've seen in West Lafayette, it's time for our Locked On Boilermakers way too early starting lineup prediction.
You are Locked On Boilermakers, your daily podcast on the Purdue Boilermakers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Boilermakers here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now, the number one sports podcast network where it's your team every day. I am your host. I am Nick Arvin, and we have an exciting episode headed your way today because we're getting into our way too early Purdue starting lineup predictions for 2026. We've talked about some of the different position groupings, some of the players I think should start, but today we're putting it all together for my official way too early starting lineup predictions. And then we're going to get into Matt Painter and Purdue potentially being linked to a 6'11" center in the transfer portal, what that tells us about Matt Painter's recruiting approach, what that tells us about potentially the center position needing to be filled, and then we'll get into a little bit of football chatter, as always, to end out today's episode, taking a look now at the wide receiver core. We took a look at the linebackers, the offensive line, now it's down to the pass catcher. So it's going to be a fun episode today of Locked On Boilermakers. Before we get into all of that, today's episode is brought to you by Mazda, and like our players, we're driven by the details. Highlights make the reel, but the work behind it makes it count. So stay tuned for this week's Mazda moving the game forward, the all-new Mazda CX-5. More to move every side of you. And with that being said, it's time to get into our way too early starting lineup predictions for the 2026-2027 Purdue Boilermakers. The reason why I wanted to do this is truly when I look at this roster from top to bottom, and obviously it's not done yet, depending on if anyone does transfer out of West Lafayette, which we haven't seen yet outside of some walk-ons like an Aaron Fine. Also haven't brought anyone in the transfer portal. So this is definitely way too early, but still, when I look up and down at this roster, I see one of the most intriguing squads that Purdue has had, because you still have some returning guys in a CJ Cox, but you also have, Caden Pierce, who you bring in the transfer portal, who's a veteran with experience, and then mix that in with some young guys, the best recruiting class Purdue has ever had, Matt Painter has ever had. It gets pretty interesting to see who's going to be the starters going into 2026 for this team. So without further ado, I want to start at the top with the general of the offense. Of course, at the point guard position, I see this as a two-man race right now for point guard. And honestly, going into last year, it was seen as it would be Omer Meyer who would be the starting point guard after Braden Smith does move on from West Lafayette. I still definitely do see that as being the case potentially, but it's going to be dependent on Omer Meyer, and can he make that sophomore leap, which he is absolutely capable of. And we even started to see as the season did progress, Omer Meyer started to get a lot more comfortable inside of the offense when he was actually able to have the ball in his hand, and he wasn't running that weird off-ball action where he just kind of stood in the corner and hoped that he would get looks. We saw against Indiana, he put up 18 points where largely he was in control, putting up shots and then converting. So if he's able to find that role in the offense, I do think there's a good chance that he's the starting point guard. But here's the issue with Omer Meyer, and it's not necessarily an issue with Omer Meyer as much as it is an issue with the position battle itself, because the guy he's battling is someone I don't think is going to be denied. Of course, I'm talking about upcoming freshman Luke Ertel, who I believe is going to be the best high school player Purdue has seen in quite a while in terms of their game actually translating from high school to college. I've never been more confident in a player translating their game from high school to college the way I am confident about Luke Ertel. And we talked about this yesterday, but Matt Painter said Luke Ertel somewhere along the lines of, he's the toughest player I've ever seen come out of high school. And that's something to say, especially when you think about the fact that this kid is taking the reins from Braden Smith. Yesterday was announced that Luke Ertel is Mr. Indiana basketball, which is just another great accolade along a long list for Luke Ertel. But I see a guy that is probably going to be in contention for that starting spot as a freshman. And what a spot to be if you're Luke Ertel. But he can make the threes, he can pass the ball all around. And I think that he's going to be extremely comfortable in a Matt Painter offense. So either way, it's going to be great for Purdue, having Omer Meyer and Luke Ertel battling out in the summer to try and see who's going to be the starting point guard of this team. Either way, in that spot, I don't necessarily believe that you can go wrong. So either way it cuts out, I'm happy with it. But I would say that Luke Ertel is going to be my starting point guard going into 2026, which moves us down to probably the easiest selection in our way too early starting lineup predictions, which is going to be CJ Cox at the shooting guard spot. Obviously, it's going to be his team going into next year. He is the returnee in the starting lineup. Assuming that Oscar Cluff doesn't come back, he will be the only starter from last year that remains at Purdue. There's no way, shape, or how that CJ Cox returns to West Lafayette and does not have a huge role next year, nor a starting spot. He's going to be huge as an off-ball guard once again in 2026. But to add to that, I think defensively, he's just going to improve, just going to get better. So I can't wait to see what CJ Cox looks like in his junior year as he comes out as a starter in 2026. But the small forward position is where it really gets tricky, and the one where there are a lot of different options that Purdue can run. And when we talked more specifically about this small forward position, I said that there are about 5 different ways that this could play out. The first of which being Gicarri Harris stays. He takes that role as a bigger small forward. You also have the potential that Antoine West slots in, but he's a lot smaller, can shoot the ball. Braden Smith said he was the most dynamic player in practice. I could see a scenario where Antoine West starts next to CJ Cox. Could also see a Jack Binner fit in there. And who's to say Omer Meyer and CJ Cox don't slot in at the 2 and the 3. There are a lot of different scenarios in which this could play out. You could also see Caden Pierce slide over to the 3, which is definitely a possibility. Purdue, their social media had him listed at 6'6". That's not typically a power forward you're going to see, or the size of a power forward you're going to see. But as of right now, if I had to make a prediction alongside Caden Pierce, which is a little bit of a spoiler, but I like the size. I want to find some size. I want to find someone that can shoot the 3 ball. And I know at times Gicarri Harris has struggled with that, but he's also shown you that he can do that. So it's kind of an upside pick here because I'm taking that size over what we've actually seen on the court. But with that, we also haven't seen Antoine West. We also haven't seen Jack Binner in a huge role, as much as I think once he's able to carve that out, he'll be able to find consistency. But I'm taking a little bit of an upside pick here and going with Gicarri Harris if he stays, which is a big if to start at that small forward position. But much like an Omer Meyer, this isn't going to be guaranteed. You've got young guys. You've got a redshirt freshman. You've got a redshirt sophomore coming up behind you, guys that want to take your spot. And for a guy in Gicarri Harris who hasn't shown much consistency over his 2 years at Purdue, this is your opportunity to prove it. If you stay in West Lafayette, you will have a chance to fight for a starting spot. But it's important that you earn that, because when you get into situations where he has the past couple of years, I even thought that he might have a chance to start last year in some different lineups. But you go into the exhibitions, he balls out, looks like the best player on the court. You get to the regular season and he can't make anything. So that can't happen this upcoming year for Gicarri Harris if he wants to be in the starting lineup. But once I think you get your size alongside who I have starting at the power forward spot, that would be your ideal lineup, because you have Caden Pierce at the power forward position. And as I mentioned, Purdue, their social media, the official graphic where he gets announced to be a Boilermaker has him listed at 6'6", which was a little bit concerning for me. Now, he's going to shoot the ball around 35% from 3. That's what he's consistently shown at Princeton, winning the Ivy League Player of the Year. But Caden Pierce, he's a dog. He was a dog in the Ivy Leagues. He will be a dog at Purdue. That's not what I'm questioning. I'm more so questioning what's the fit going to be in that front court, because you rarely see front courts that are smaller. And now with a guy that is 6'6" at your power forward spot, what are you going to do in order to be able to compete with some of that size? We see Michigan is already starting to revamp that roster going into next year. They'll be able to contend again. Illinois, they're going to be huge again. So you have to find a way to get that size in your starting lineup in order to compete with some of these other teams. And if you don't have that size, you have to find other ways to beat them. Now, I think for a power forward, Caden Pierce is going to be one of the most explosive, quickest players you can find. So there's no question you bring him in for a reason because he's going to start. It's just a question of will he be at that small forward spot or will he be at the power forward spot? I do think that he will be at the power forward spot, which brings us down to the center position. So far, we've got Luke Ertel at point guard. We got CJ Cox at the 2, Gicarri Harris at the 3, and Caden Pierce at the 4, which brings us in to our center position. And this is the question that we're really looking at right now, because you still have Oscar Cluff up in the air as the days go on. It looks more doubtful that he will be able to return to Purdue, but we should have a preliminary injunction decided on today regarding the Brody Robinson case, which will give us a little bit more knowledge on what the situation is with Oscar Cluff. So let's assume for a second that that doesn't go in his favor. Oscar Cluff is no longer in West Lafayette. I just don't see a scenario where, number one, a Daniel Jacobson is able to start for a Big Ten program. I don't see it. I don't think he's quick enough, and I don't think he has the size to compete inside of the paint quite yet. He will in a year, he will in 2 years, but not quite yet, assuming that he does stay in West Lafayette. That brings you down to Burgess, who might be able to play, but I still don't know what a redshirt freshman is going to provide for you in that starting lineup. You got Sinan Han, who could be able to slot in to that lineup. But once again, it takes a little bit to develop these 7-footers. So I see the most likely scenario is that Purdue does end up going after a center in the portal, much like they did for Oscar Cluff last year. Find that hole in your roster and identify it with a portal transfer. I see Purdue going after a center, and that's what Matt Painter has showed that he wants to do throughout the course of this early offseason. He wants a center, and that's what we're talking about here next. My starting lineup is Luke Ertel, CJ Cox, Gicarri Harris, Caden Pierce, and a transfer center, and Matt Painter might be looking at one right now because he was linked to a 6'11" transfer. We'll see if there's any truth, any fiction to that coming up here next on Locked On Boilermakers. But first, this is Mazda's moving the game forward. For those who know, the score never tells the whole story. And going into 2026, our Mazda moving the game forward player of the game, of the year, whatever it may be, has to be CJ Cox. The lone returning starter in that starting lineup is going to show that there's more to these players than just the highlights. It's the early mornings, late night runs, constantly showing up for their squad on and off the court. And CJ Cox is going to do just that. And the all-new Mazda CX-5 moves the exact same way, with more space to connect, a bold new design, and more intuitive technology so you can stay connected to the road in every position you will play. The all-new Mazda CX-5, more to move every side of you. Today's episode also brought to you by TurboTax, and it's tax time, but for a lot of us, the old way of doing taxes is a lot. Trying to book an appointment that's not the most convenient, sitting in a waiting room with a stack of papers or emailing back and forth and wondering if they really got your situation. Well, this year, you're getting a major upgrade because Intuit TurboTax now has in-person locations nationwide where you can meet face-to-face with a real tax expert and your documents get uploaded straight to your TurboTax app on the spot. And just like that, you're done. Your TurboTax expert works to get you every dollar you deserve while you get real-time notifications as you go about your day. It's the relief of walking in and meeting a real person and walking out knowing your taxes are being handled right. Well, head on over to turbotax.com/local to find a store near you and book your appointment today. As I mentioned in the previous segment, the center spot in 2026 is going to be the one position where Matt Painter probably isn't going to find a starter for someone who was on the roster last year or an upcoming recruit, which means he might utilize the transfer portal. And that goes along with some of the reports that have come out over the past couple of days. That's what we're going to get into here in this segment. In a 6'11" center that Purdue was linked to yesterday. Before we get into that, though, I do just want to tell you guys once again about that Everydayer Club. It's such a fun time. You're going to get all that ad-free Locked On Boilermakers content you already love. Additionally, you're going to get access to the Everydayer Club Discord chat where you can talk to me, talk to all the Everydayers out there. It's a great time in the Everydayer Club. So I'll leave that link down in the description below. But let's get into the center debate, the conversation surrounding what is Purdue going to do in the starting lineup when it pertains to the center position in 2026. And it's a little bit tricky because as of right now, we still do have the Oscar Cluff situation up in the air. And the whole reason for that is because the Brody Robinson case is still ongoing into today, where a preliminary injunction should be decided to see if Brody Robinson will be eligible to use the transfer portal. And the reason why that is relevant is because Brody Johnson played a year of JUCO ball. Yes, Oscar Cluff played 2, but if a waiver was extended once again over NCAA, it would make all JUCO years invalid to count against your eligibility, meaning that Oscar Cluff would still have a 4th year left in order to play high major basketball. That would mean that Oscar Cluff could return, which he said if he had the ability to do. He didn't want to bend any rules, but if he had the ability to do it, he would return to West Lafayette. That's the situation, and that's why it's a little bit interesting to see, is Purdue going to go after a center? Are they not? Are they confident in Oscar Cluff coming back? And the reports that have come out over the past week or so have kind of shown me that they are not confident on Oscar Cluff coming back, because Brian Newbert originally reports that Matt Painter, the Purdue Boilermakers, are searching to bring in a center in the transfer portal this offseason. You contribute that with the fact that yesterday we talked about Sleepers Media, a video that they put out saying that Matt Painter, or a Purdue staffer, they were on a Zoom call with Brandon Garrison. That doesn't necessarily make me think that Purdue is going after Brandon Garrison out of Kentucky, but what it does make me think is that Purdue is going after a center right now in the transfer portal. And that's why I said in the previous segment that if Purdue is going to complete that starting lineup, it makes more sense for me to have a transfer portal guy brought in compared to a younger guy or a younger center that's still on the roster, because you're still going to want to compete this year, even with having these younger guys, even with it being a bit of a transition year, so to speak. You're still going to want to compete, and bringing in a transfer portal center is going to give you the best opportunity to do that. So you combine all of these different reports from the week, combine that with the whole Brody Robinson situation, and you start to see that may be the case. But yesterday we got that first real report from a credible journalist that said Purdue was in on a 6'11" center. That guy is Oregon State transfer Johan Munch, who tells League Ready that he's receiving interest from the following programs. I'll read the report for you. It's Florida, Purdue, Tennessee, Creighton, USC, UCLA, Arizona State, SMU, Clemson, Ole Miss, Cal, Florida State, South Carolina State. He's 6'11", averaged 7.9 points per game last year, 5.1 rebounds, and an assist per game. Now, this tells us that a bunch of different teams, I think it was 12 or 13 teams that I just named, are in on him, which is a lot and doesn't necessarily mean that Purdue is going to be the front runner or that they are going to get Johan Munch, because personally, I don't think he's that big of an upgrade outside of Daniel Jacobson. If you're going to go after a center in the portal, I want to see someone a little bit better than Munch. And that's nothing against his game, but the reality of the fact is that you're only averaging a little bit under 8 points per game. You have a good rim protecting. Your ability to protect the rim is pretty solid, but I would rather just start Daniel Jacobson and be done with it. Say, we'll take what happens, good or bad, with Daniel Jacobson and let him develop, compared to spending money on someone that's not going to be that much of an upgrade from DJ. So Purdue is linked to Munch, but I don't necessarily think it would be the best decision. Much like yesterday, I didn't think getting Brandon Garrison would be the best decision. So this doesn't necessarily tell me that Purdue is going to get Munch, as much as it tells me that Purdue is in on getting a center in the transfer portal, which is a huge takeaway from me. When we look at stuff like this, I do think that Purdue is going to go after a center as of right now, but I'm still going to keep my eyes on the Brody Robinson case. That's going to be decided today. When we look at who Purdue might want out of that portal, though, I don't think it's going to be a top 5 guy. I don't think it's going to be a top 10 guy, because in the reality of the situation is I just don't see Matt Painter spending a ton of money. It's kind of like you have two sides of the coin with this, where you're going through this bit of a progression year, transition year, whatever you want to call it, where you're trying to develop these younger guys, and you want an older center that's going to be able to help you compete, but you also don't want a center that you're going to pay a whole ton of money for that doesn't fit the dynamic of a team, or that's not going to be a huge upgrade for the squad. So you need to find a guy kind of in that middle tier that's going to command some money, that because they're going to be an upgrade, but also isn't going to break the bank and isn't going to be a guy you give a ton of money to that's not going to be able to help produce or fit in with the current roster. So that's where I see Purdue at as of right now. We're keeping an eye on the Brody Robinson case. Purdue has showed interest in Johan Munch, but I don't necessarily see that as a definite sign that Purdue will be pursuing him long-term into the future. What I do believe is that Purdue is pursuing a center, and we will keep you guys updated here on Locked On Boilermakers as we get more details on Matt Painter's approach, pursue, whatever you want to call it, of a center, because it is happening as we speak. We'll see how it plays out. One more thing to mention is that Purdue, and this is something that Raphael Davis, we had him on the show, but he mentioned Purdue has never gotten a traditional transfer out of the portal. It's always been a graduate transfer. You look at Oscar Cluff, you look at Caden Pierce. That's something else that you have to look at when we take a look at Purdue in the pursuit of a transfer portal center. But as of right now, it's looking like that is the case. So once again, we will keep you guys updated as more details come out about Purdue's pursuit for a center. But here coming up next, as we end out today's episode, I want to get into some football chatter. Yesterday, we talked about the offensive line. On Wednesday, we talked about the linebacker core. But today, we're talking about those pass catchers in a new look wide receiver core. So that's coming up here next on Locked On Boilermakers. But first, you have workplace chaos, deadline stacking up, the inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill still sitting open when the pressure's on and you need the right hire. This is the job for Sponsored Jobs. Indeed, Sponsored Jobs helps you reach the people who actually fit what you're looking for. That means skills, experience, and location. So you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. And here's a stat that says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours have already made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all of your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners of the show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire. Well, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Today's episode also brought to you by Robinhood. And what if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time. With Robinhood prediction markets, it's not you against the house. It's you participating in a live market where you can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use the sports knowledge in the moments that matter, because Robinhood prediction markets changes the game, where it's people moving the action. So when the momentum shifts, you can move with it. And I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. But now I can actually take part live in a market powered by the people, where you're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. So trade every play with Robinhood, now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives, LLC, a registered futures commission, merchant, and swap firm. We've been ending out almost every episode this week taking a look at the football program, because spring practice is underway, and with a bunch of different new position coaches, it's important to look at these different groups, what they're going to look like for Purdue going into 2026. On Wednesday, we took a look at the linebacker core under new defensive coordinator, or old defensive coordinator, whatever you want to call it, and Kevin Kane. He's got that relentless, now attack-first linebacker core that I think is going to be pretty sneaky good going into next year. And then yesterday, we took a look at that offensive line. Now, under new offensive line coach Zach Crabtree, you bring in a bunch of guys from South Carolina, USC, and Oklahoma State. You've got size, but will that be able to turn into a chemistry on the offensive line under Crabtree? That's still to be seen, but there's a little bit of optimism there as well. Today, we're going to get into a position group that I don't necessarily know if there's optimism or not, but it's certainly new look, because under Bilal Marshall, he was an offensive analyst last year for Barry Odom, and then this year gets promoted up to wide receivers coach. He's got a lot of work to do to try to build this core into a unit that's going to be able to make life easy for Ryan Brown out of the pocket this year. And I do just want to mention, before we get into these receivers, I don't necessarily think that this is going to be an offense in 2026, where you're going to see kind of like last year, where you've got your guys, you got Ryan Brown trying to sling the rock because you're not necessarily able to run the ball a lot of the time. I do think that this year Purdue is going to be more dependent on that running game, and I do believe that it will be a little bit more successful. So we take a look at these receivers, and I do just want to say that there's not going to be as much pressure on these guys to make plays as there was last year. I think that the game will come to this receiving core a little bit easier than it did last year, just because you do have that running game, a better running game than you did last year, even with a guy in Devin Mockabee not being here anymore. But let's take a little bit of a look at what happened in the portal, because there were some big transfers, big additions as well that do happen. And the first ones that kind of sticks out to me are the two guys that transfer. It's Nitro Tuggle, who produced a decent amount last year for you. He transfers to South Carolina, and Armhan Branch now transfers to USF. I think that that's pretty key, but Armhan Branch, we remember how that played out the first 2 games of the year. I thought that this guy was going to be the future of Purdue football. He was going to be special with Ryan Brown, and ultimately just doesn't produce much the rest of the season. And then Nitro Tuggle, he did a solid job throughout the course of the year, being a key piece. Key piece is it's a strong word to say, but I would say that Nitro Tuggle was pretty key. He was a silver lining for the receiving core going into last year for a squad that didn't produce too much. Along with Nitro Tuggle and Armhan Branch, Michael Jackson III, one of my favorites, no longer has eligibility. So you're pretty well looking at rebuilding this receiver core from the ground up. Now, Denylon Morissette is coming back for another year at Purdue. That is going to be one piece that you have going into next year. He battled some injuries last year, so didn't see a whole lot of him. So Barry Odom, Purdue, and of course Bill Marshall, they realized that this receiving core is going to need to be built up from the ground, and that's what they do in the transfer portal, going after 4 guys that are all very different, but I feel like when you put them into a receiver core, you could see production. And the first guy, the one that I'm most excited about, as most people are, is Xavier Townsend, coming out of Iowa State. He got on the field at Iowa State and was able to produce a little bit for the Cyclones. He comes in looking to be a slot receiver for Purdue going into this year. I assume that he will be the starter, but you've also got BZ Owens, who comes in from Penn. He's 6'4", 215, absolute dog in terms of size. We'll see how that actually produces in order to his speed. Is he able to jump? But I think the size is something that you look at when you recruit him. You also have Asad Wasim, who comes over from FAU. Much like Xavier Townsend, I expect him to be kind of that slot receiver type guy. I could see him playing under Xavier Townsend as that backup slot receiver. And then you got Jalen Hornsby on the other side coming over from Syracuse. He's 6'3", 215 pounds. I could see those guys, the two big guys, of course. You've got Jalen Hornsby and BZ Owens. I could potentially see them slotting in at the X and the Z, and then having someone like an Xavier Townsend coming in at the slot. Who knows what happens with Denylon Morissette, but at least you have options this year, which you did have last year. Overall, I do see this receiving core as a little bit of a step back from where we were last year with an Armhan Branch, with a Nitro Tuggle, with a Michael Jackson III, which is a bit of a bold take, but I just haven't seen these guys necessarily be stars for their programs. And I don't think that they're as highly touted recruits or as highly touted transfers as some of the guys that you bring in to play linebacker for you, to play edge for you, or to play offensive line for you. So that's why there's a little bit of concern on my side in terms of what are these guys actually going to be able to do on the field. But as I mentioned to start out this segment, it's important that we realize that these guys aren't going to be the live or die for Purdue going into next year. Purdue isn't going to want to run an offense like they did last year, where Ryan Brown is forced to just kind of chuck that ball up and hope that something good happens. So I'm hoping for that reason that hopefully Purdue is able to find some success outside of these wide receivers going into next year. But if you need to find Xavier Townsend shrieking down the field, maybe you can do that on a slant, on a post, whatever you need. Maybe some of these big guys on the outside will be able to produce for you as well. There's a lot of upside, low floor for these guys is kind of the way that I feel about it. But once again, I don't think that Purdue is going to play through their wide receivers a whole lot. Do think that Kylan Fox, who is the transfer out of UCF at tight end, 6'4", 235 pounds, could get some production from Ryan Brown. We've seen him want to hit his tight ends, did that last year at times with Rico Walker. I could see Ryan Brown going after his tight ends this year and running an offense where that's an option. You can go through your running backs. He can even improvise and run on his feet. But overall, I don't think that this receiving core is going to be able to stun you this year. It's going to be a star-studded receiving core. I think they're going to be there. I think they're going to be able to produce when they need to. But ultimately, this is not going to be a team played through their wide receivers in 2026. That's your look at the wide receiver core for going into next year. Bilal Marshall has a lot of work to do throughout spring ball and throughout the summer to try to get this group ready to catch some balls from Ryan Brown. We'll see how it goes. But once again, just to recap today's episode, our starting lineup: Luke Ertel, you got CJ Cox, Gicarri Harris, Caden Pierce, and a transfer center. Purdue is linked to 6'11" transfer Johan Munch. We'll see how that plays out. Don't necessarily think he's the guy for Purdue, but that shows that there is some interest in bringing in a center. And Purdue's receiving core has a lot of work to do. Not a ton of stars. I love Xavier, Townsend, but we'll have to see how those guys are able to develop into one core group. But that's all I got for you guys today. It was a fun episode of Locked On Boilermakers. Make sure you guys hop in that everyday or club Discord chat. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment. It helps us out a ton as we want to continue to grow this channel. But as always, boiler up, hammer down.